at some point in time that we can, if we get more of our group back together, we will finally get back into 1 Corinthians. I know that we were right at that juncture of like one study into chapter 11, which is really kind of the best place you want to leave things, is right at the very beginning of chapter 11. But we're going to continue in Proverbs. I hope that you guys participate quite a bit. It's been a long time since I've had participation on a Wednesday night class. It'd be very nice to get input. It's been a long time. So we're going to hopefully go through chapter 14 tonight. And I realize that, obviously I've been talking to you guys quite a bit and haven't heard any feedback. So hopefully this hasn't been too long of a process.
I had a question on chapter 1.
That would make a whole lot of sense if that did happen. Like, back here in chapter 6. Has it been a beneficial study to kind of just go through the chapters without kind of picking out themes or anything? Some of the Proverbs are going to be rather straightforward, and some of them are going to be, a little less straightforward. For instance, where he mentions here in verse 2 that whoever walks in uprightness fears the Lord, but he who is devious in his ways despises him. I think that just kind of means exactly what it says. But in verse 4, just 2 verses later, when there is no oxen, the manger is clean, but the abundance of crops comes by the strength of the ox. Like, that obviously does apply to oxen and mangers, but there's like a whole nother set of, truth behind that. It's really nice to have a quiet church, but, without children in the church, that is the strength of a congregation, is having that next generation coming up. So I think that there's that applies the same thing. So let's just go ahead and go through chapter 14 together. Let's read, someone would, verse 1.
The wise woman builds her house, but the foolish pulls it down with her hands.
So South Africa, there's actually a tradition of women literally building the house. There were some places we went to, we got to see the women out there making the mud bricks and setting them up. And traditionally, the men would guard and protect from other people and protect from wild animals, while the women literally built the houses. And then once the walls were up, then the men would come inside and the women would come inside and build the roof. I don't think that's what Solomon is talking about. I don't think that he's advocating for all women everywhere to literally build all the houses. But if you want to make that case, here's a good proof text for it. But what is he talking about?
Can you point to the verse? I didn't.
Yeah, what's the point of the verse? Verse 1.
Number.
Verse 1.
Oh.
Chapter 14.
Talking about the household, the people of the household. The woman can destroy her family by pulling it down, or she can build out for her children.
Yeah.
Probably the most different.
Yeah, and so as we're going to get into eventually over into chapter 31, he gives the example of the wise woman who builds her house. And then he mentions that, here in verse 1, through folly, with her own hands, she can tear it down. It's going to depend a lot not only on the father, but also on the mother as well.
I'll just say his name is Mike, but American people talking sarcastically. If Mike, the brother-in-law, would say that, a woman is the neck, he's the head, but she's the neck, and there's the head, whichever which one. And he says that, tongue in cheek, kind of jokingly, but that is very true too. A woman has a lot of control over not only even though the man is supposed to be in control of the household, the head of the household, the wife can have very much influence and impact on how well the man does at that, or how poorly he does. And if she's wise, she's helping build him up so that he can properly lead the house. At the same time, she's also
Yeah, we've been dealing with a couple passages already through Proverbs where he deals with an abundance of counselors, and by good companionship, people are established. There's some pretty good, interesting studies on presidents and their ability to pick out and to establish like really good cabinets or support teams. Obviously, the president is where the buck stops, but his ability to have a support team that's able to effectively put into action the things that he's detailed for the country makes or breaks a president. So his intelligence is not always the guide. In fact, one of the most intelligent presidents we've ever had is probably Carter. I mean, Carter is probably one of the most intelligent IQ point-wise presidents that we've ever had, period. Also one of the least effective presidents because he could not build a cabinet around him that could effectively execute his vision for the country. That's just a side point, but that applies to the partnership that's in the family. A wise husband is going to be someone who relies heavily on his wife, both in counsel and understanding and also execution of plans for the family. Lee?
You see the tearing down piece as far as kingdoms in Rehoboam, who does exactly that. Instead of choosing the wise counsel from his father, what he decides is he'll choose the younger counselors, the ones that are kind of cool in his age, and they give him, I don't know, maybe so far as ungodly, but certainly unwise counsel, and it tears the whole kingdom apart, and he loses the whole kingdom. Or he could have went the other way at the beginning of this verse, and he could have taken wise counsel, and maybe he could have been a much better king.
Let's look over Ruth chapter 4. I know we're probably, I'm able to kind of blitz through all of a chapter in a Bible class by myself. But since you guys are here, we will luckily get to take a little more time with it. But Ruth chapter 4, notice what is said here in verse 11. It says, "Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, 'We are witnesses, and may the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together build up the house of Israel. And may you act worthy in Ephrath, and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman.'" So the elders of the city make this proclamation, "May the Lord make your house like Rachel and Leah, who built up the house of Israel." And we think of Israel as being, Judah or Joshua being Jacob. Jacob being the one who did all the work. And because as you go through Genesis, he's the one who's, making the deals. He's the one who's out there working the fields and picking out either the spotted or the speckled. He's the one who's making the choice when to leave and where to go to. He's the one who's making the sacrifices and the offerings. But behind the scenes, so to speak, here in Ruth, the elders make the proclamation that it was Rachel and Leah that bore a lot of that responsibility for building up the house. And so Solomon says in chapter 14, verse 1, "The wisest of women builds her house, but with folly, her own hands tear it down." How about Proverbs 14, verse 2?
He who walks in his uprightness fears the Lord, but he who is perverse in his ways despises him.
Sometimes saying things one way makes an impact, and then if you reverse them, it can make it can make a stronger impact, or it can hit you in a way that stated the other way doesn't. Being able to turn a phrase can really make or break an idea in somebody's mind, and that's what Solomon does here, where he's been stated the other way before, that if you fear the Lord, that will lead to wisdom. Now he's saying that if you walk in uprightness, that indicates that you fear the Lord. But if you walk deviously, or if you walk pervertedly, then you despise the Lord. And a lot of people have a hard time grasping that in their own life, where they believe that they fear the Lord or they love God, and then still can harbor and abide all of these other sins in their life. They can be devious in X, Y, and Z and still be mostly someone who loves God. And Solomon is making the point, it's going to be one or the other. Either you walk in uprightness and you fear God, or you are devious or perverse and you despise him. You can't have it both ways.
That's an interesting verse, Chad. It's almost like cause and effect. But it could almost be said that those who fear the Lord walk upright, or those who despise the Lord are perverted.
Mm-hmm.
It's the cause and effect of that. You don't walk upright on your own, and that causes you to fear the Lord. You fear the Lord, and that causes you to walk upright.
Mm-hmm. And obviously we dealt with this a couple chapters back in chapter 11 and chapter 12, dealing with the mouth and how we speak uprightly or we speak perversely. And I've been surprised how many people who will spend their time arguing over parts of, points of Christianity or proclaiming their love for God, only to then turn around almost immediately, to use their mouth for the exact opposite of what God would have them. And Solomon, I think, is also speaking to that here in verse 2, that if you act deviously or perversely, that indicates, the cause and effect, indicates that you despise him. And so he then kind of continues on into verse 3, that the mouth of the fool comes, by the mouth of a fool comes a rod for his back, but the lips of the wise will preserve them. Now, Solomon, I think, hopefully we'll get into this later on whenever we get talking into Ecclesiastes. Proverbs is the ideal. Proverbs is the sunshine, the ray of hope. This is how things ought to be if you live uprightly and just. This is how things are going to go for you. And Ecclesiastes comes along and says, but not always. And then he wrestles with the why is it not always. But what's his point here in verse 3?
Well, by not being foolish, by being wise, it helps protect the person. But the person who is a fool, his actions come back to get him. Ish.
So the guy who tried to eat his way out of the Marines, that was a rod to his back.
Foolish move.
Yeah. And isn't that, that's obviously a very worldly example of it, but that comes in a lot of different ways. That if you talk foolishly, does it often bring either reproach or actual punishment of some kind? And if you just kept your mouth shut, things would have been a lot easier for you. I'm sure we've met people like that. And he makes the point that the lips of the wise will preserve them. And there in verse 4, I think this is what we've already mentioned this before, that where there is no oxen, the manger is clean. Obviously there's this benefit to the lack of these dirty, messy animals, but then the opposite is also true, that the abundance of crops comes by the strength of oxen. So obviously there's a lot of applications for this, whether it be people who really love a tidy house, and hate having kids around, even though kids are really the hope of the future. And the same thing when it comes to churches. I've seen a lot of times where people get up and reprimand a whole audience for kids being loud. Well, yeah, sure. Where there is no kids, the congregation's super quiet. But also, children are the strength of a congregation. That if you have a quiet church, you probably also have a dead church, as someone often said. So a lot of applications for this. That if you're, and we won't get into all the possible ones, and so that's why Solomon has it as a proverb. One of these things that you can memorize it, and then you can apply it to a variety of circumstances. Any thoughts on verse 4?
Wouldn't it also mean workers?
Could be workers. And we might get into the topic pretty soon. Romans chapter 12, right around verse 8, where he mentions associate with the lowly. And you get into all the examples of Jesus dealing with the tax collectors and sinners. I don't know how bad you have to be or what kind of person of reputation you have to be known universally as a sinner. But that kind of tends to bring a lot of messiness to a congregation. It's really easy to grab, so-and-so over here who's a pretty good person already, and then just teach them the little finer points of Christianity and bring them into the church. It's a whole other issue sometimes to get down to those who really need a physician. There's the doctor's office that only does well visits and the doctor's office that does triage, two very different places. One of them saves lives, and one of them signs permission forms. And that also, I think, comes along with it as well. That there's a lot of tidiness that happens inside of a church that only evangelizes to people who are already well-to-do and already pretty well squared away with Christian values, as opposed to a congregation that's going to evangelize to the sick spiritually. And understand that there's going to be work that comes along with that. But that work is going to be worthwhile because that's really going to be where people need, people who need the gospel. How about verse 5 and 6 and 7?
5, 6, and 7?
Mm-hmm.
A faithful witness does not lie, but a false witness will utter lies. A scoffer seeks wisdom and does not find it, but knowledge is easy for him to understand. Go from the presence of the foolish man when you do not perceive in his lips, and when you do not perceive in him the lips of knowledge.
All right, so I think in these 3 verses somewhat go together. He was going to mention later on in chapter 14 about those who have false witness. But all of these kind of tie together with an individual who bears false witness, who scoffs, and someone who speaks like a fool. All of these kind of tie together in that sense. So Solomon arranged these to go together. Why does he keep repeating the idea of false witnesses? This isn't the first time he's mentioned it, and it's definitely not going to be the last time he mentions it here in Proverbs. Is there a tendency to, if not outright lie about some things that happen, at least to bend the truth or to present the facts in a way that are really favorable to you? Like whenever you run and tell mom that, brother hit me, and then you just happen to neglect the fact that you probably broke his finger beforehand, and then out of retaliation, then he hit you. We all tend to have that natural reaction to present evidences and present half-truths or facts in a way that promotes our case rather than is a detriment to us. And that's not only for us, but also for those who we may be giving a testimony for or giving a witness for. Solomon just always comes back to the fact that we ought to always tell the truth. That's no matter what the reason is, there's not really ever a good reason to not give a true testimony.
I think that, I don't think that I'm unique in this. We want to be able to trust people. Even speaking outside of Christianity, a worldly person, they want to be able to trust you. I think that lying is probably one of the most damaging things you can do to a relationship, if not the most damaging thing you can do. And you can break in my house and steal from me, I'll get over that. But trust someone who has lied to you can be a difficult thing. It can be difficult to overcome. One of those easier said than done things. But as a Christian, if I'm caught in a lie and it's a question of my character, and I'm hoping to bring salvation to someone, I would have to think in your mind, what else am I not being honest about?
Mm-hmm.
It's a very damaging thing, and like you said, it's really easy because if your body's hurt, we try to preserve life, we try to preserve ourselves, and sometimes it's really easy just to kind of alter things a little bit to get out of an uncomfortable situation, or you see maybe stretch the truth, as you said, a little bit. That's a really easy thing to do. As a matter of fact, it's something we have to fight against sometimes, depending on our situations. I don't think it matters how mature you are, you still catch yourself. You want to take the easy route out and alter that.
Mm-hmm.
But when you damage your relationship with someone and they're questioning your integrity by a lie, especially as a Christian, that might not be recoverable with the worldly person.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
One of the abominations to God, too, right?
Mm-hmm.